The international recognition of a human right to a healthy environment, preceded by decades of progress in national constitutions, lawmaking, and case law, and decades of progressive development of international human rights law, certainly provides the most powerful obligations for states to take integrated environmental protection. And this is crucial for effective climate action, as we have paid less attention about the protection of human rights in the context of climate change in relation to the role of biodiversity and the marine environment in climate change mitigation and adaptation, as well as in meaningfully responding to loss and damage and providing meaningful remedies. Since taking office as UN Special Rapporteur on Climate Change and Human Rights, I have been very concerned about the evidence and well-documented cases of climate change responses that have negatively impacted terrestrial, freshwater, and marine biodiversity, and how this leads to a further stream of human rights violations on top of the human rights impact of climate change. We simply cannot afford for any climate measure to severely impact on biodiversity and the marine environment, because that in itself makes our climate system less safe. But it also furthers the climate harms to human rights, particularly for those in most vulnerable situations, and it undermines everyone's resilience and adaptive capacities to respond to climate change impacts. Also, to quote the words of the UN Special Rapporteur on the human right to health, that reestablishing those connections between humans and nature and healthy ecosystems is essential to facilitate healing at the individual and community level and to forge intergenerational alliances towards a safer climate. So integrated environmental action is essential for transformative change, the kind of change that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, and Agenda 2030 have been asking for us to make meaningful progress to protect human rights in the context of a combined planetary crisis. So what transformative change means is a shift away from technocratic and regulatory fixes of environmental problems, and rather moving towards more fundamental changes in our socio-political processes and economic relations at different scales and, of course, across sectors. So integration is essential, a part of that transformative change, but it's not the only element. We need inclusive processes that empower those whose interests have been left behind time and again, and who represent transformative sustainability values. We need adaptive governance that's based on learning, in fact, mutual iterative learning, experimentation, reflexivity, monitoring, and feedback as part also of how we understand the precautionary approach. And we need transdisciplinary governance, structure that support mutual learning across different knowledge systems, carefully considering the existing barriers and power imbalances and continuing prejudices that have prevented the inclusion of underrepresented knowledge systems in our decision-making processes at all levels. The human right to a healthy environment then can help us explore all these dimensions and guide us in navigating the complex challenges of transformation, the politics of transformation, preventing a shift of the burden of response onto the vulnerable, addressing issues of legitimacy and equity among states, as well as within states, and revealing the human rights dimensions of interstate obligations related to scientific cooperation, capacity building, and the development of technology. In my recent work as UN Special Rapporteur on Climate Change and Human Rights, I have focused on how the human right to a healthy environment can help us interpret other areas of international human rights law in the light of the indivisibility of human rights and the need for integrated environmental action, because of those deep interconnections between human well-being and the environment from bacterial to planetary levels. And very much thinking about this transformative change and the scientific evidence and the legal thinking that we need to really be able to respond to the compounded human rights violations that have now been experienced in the countries and territories that have already been affected by over a decade of severe climate change impacts. So first, I've been reflecting on how we interpret the human right to self-determination in the light of the human right to a healthy environment, considering the nature of self-determination as a peremptory norm of international law. And it is essential to think about how people may be substantially deprived of their means of subsistence or cultural survival because of the severe deterioration of their entire ecosystems due to climate change, combined with other climate change impacts such as sea level rise and the overall impacts of protracted unsafe climatic conditions. The obligation to ensure maximum available resources under the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights is another area of international human rights law that needs to be interpreted in the light of the human right to a healthy environment, and very much understanding when states support any activities that undermine the remaining global carbon budget and undermine ecosystem services that are negatively impacted by climate change, then this is a case in which clearly states are not ensuring maximum available resources for the full realization of economic, social, and cultural rights. Equally, there's an opportunity to interpret this area of international law as entailing an obligation for states to condition public funding and any other support to an activity on the basis of understanding whether or not that activity has been assessed at the nexus of climate, biodiversity, water, food, and health. And we have now a new IPBES global assessment that can provide a very recent assessment of the available evidence to that end. Clearly, the human right to development needs to be interpreted in the light of the human right to a healthy environment. We already have significant work in this direction by the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to development and the Special Rapporteur on human rights and extreme poverty, all calling for an obligation to develop new economic models that provide only the goods and services that are essential for human well-being and that contribute to planetary well-being. They reduce the production of unnecessary products or toxic products, and they deprioritize the demands of the richest groups in society if this worsens social exclusion and extreme poverty. My proposition as Special Rapporteur on Climate Change and Human Rights focuses on the importance of understanding the obligation to develop new economic models in a way that fully aligns with all the substantive elements of the right to a healthy environment, and in particular, taking into account children's right to development and their right to a healthy environment. Not in a paternalistic way, in understanding how the best interest of the child must be a consideration that supports intergenerational equity, but rather thinking about the structures, the scientific evidence, and the processes that allow for children themselves to be heard, for their agency to be exercised, so that their present and future choices are not bound by decisions made by others to the detriment of their rights. The UN General Comment 26 on children's rights to a healthy environment, despite having an explicit focus on climate change, provides meaningful interpretative direction in terms of integrated environmental protection, very much calling attention to environmental degradation in all its forms, being a form of structural violence against children and potentially leading to social collapse of communities and families. And calling for the consideration of all factors required for children of all different ages to survive, develop, and thrive to their fullest potential and across their full life course. So these are critical legal elements to help interpret the right to development for children and for everyone in an intergenerational perspective. And furthermore, the general comment also calls attention to the need to consider differential impact of environmental decisions on children against short, medium, and long-term combined and irreversible impacts, taking into account interactive and cumulative impacts in different stages of childhood. And very much comparing also our understanding of the impacts on adults, which may appear reasonable on an individual or shorter timescale, as opposed to what is unreasonable once seen in the aggregate, and considering the full harm that will cause to children throughout their life courses. In addition, on that note on transformation, some of my work has been focusing also on the evidence showing how children have distinctive insights that can support integrated and transformative environmental decision-making, because their imagination is very different from adult cognition, because their experiences of time and place are distinctive, and that provides innovative thinking that can support all of us, and in fact, support adults' capacities to reimagine our economic and social systems in transformative ways. My final note of reflection is about also the need to understand the human right to effective remedies in a transformative way and in the light of the human right to a healthy environment. Very much thinking about how those remedies can create the space for reclaiming self-determination, for restoring our human connections with nature, facilitating the process of healing and protection of the human right to health, as well as providing a generative space for reimagining economic models in that light of the human right to development and the human right to a healthy environment in all of its substantive dimensions. And I think there's a really important interface and interaction between rehabilitation and particularly a focus on sociocultural and ecological restoration. Once again, thinking about the nexus between climate, biodiversity, water, food, and health in self-determined ways that can support the protection and realization of human rights through co-developed processes. Combined with, I think, the importance of guarantees of non-repetition that take into account the impacts of our decisions across all substantive dimensions of the human right to a healthy environment. And I think while there is a lot of resistance and concern around financial and other implications of fully protecting the human right to effective remedies, we need to also fully illuminate the transformative potential of that right to contribute to more effective, meaningful, and inclusive integrated environmental action, where we can rediscover or discover economic and socio-political models that support mitigation, adaptation to climate change, prevention and responses to loss and damage, while ensuring that the maximum available financial, human capacity, and natural resources are made available to tackle the planetary crisis.